Okay, so this is Thomas, and I am going to be teaching him about chapter 12 of our business law textbook, which is about the UCC risk of loss and contract performance. UCC is the Uniform Commercial Code.
All right.
So we'll explain more about that. But I think this first part is important. It says the UCC has special provisions to determine who bears the risk of loss when goods are destroyed, and the contract is silent about who bears the risk. To understand these principles, it's important to identify the goods, understand which party has title to the goods, and determine when the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer. So it's first important to identify the goods themselves. So for example, like I know that I think it was in the textbook. Yeah, I think it was in the textbook. It talked about one example of a guy who is selling his horse to another guy, and he says like, hey, the horse is ready. I'm just going to tie him up to the tree outside whenever you want to come get him. And then when the guy comes to get him the next morning, the horse is dead. So it's like, so we're talking about situations like these where things don't go according to plan in the contract. So for example, in that situation, the horse would be the good, right?
Yeah. So what happens to the guy who bought it? He just gets his money back.
I will tell you in a second. So, okay, we first have to talk about the passage of title.
But I want to know about this guy getting his money back.
You will. So the passage of title. So the UCC indicates title passes to the buyer when the seller delivers the goods. So there's two different types of passage of titles, right? So the passage of title is just ownership, basically. When does one person get ownership?
So when we pay off our house, we get our title.
Right.
Because we own the house at that point.
Yes, exactly. So these two situations, so one is a shipment contract. So when the seller is shipping something, so in a shipment contract, the seller is permitted to ship goods by carrier. And so all contracts involving delivery are assumed to be shipping contracts, right? So the title passes when the seller delivers the item to the actual carrier itself. So if you're shipping something.
Okay.
If you're delivering something and it's a destination contract, it's a delivery agreement. So this would be like, for example, say our neighbor across the street makes cookies. So if she's delivering cookies to someone and she does that as part of her business deal, the title passes when the seller, which would be her, delivers the goods to the buyer. And so, for example, if something happened, say like she tripped down the stairs and broke all the cookies, but she wasn't at the person's house and she hadn't given them to him, it's still her responsibility. She has to take care of that at that point. It's not the buyer's fault at all. And then the last situation is, so let's see here, when the buyer picks up the goods. So this is kind of what we were talking about. In these cases, there are no shipment terms, but rather the title passes when the buyer takes possession and the seller gives the buyer a receipt if applicable. If the goods do not move, the title passes when the appropriate documents are delivered to the buyer. So in the horse case, the ownership would pass when the buyer came to get the goods and actually had them in his possession. So in that situation, the seller would still be responsible for the horse. So we'll go over risk of loss. And so
what would happen if the buyer went to go get the horse, decided that he didn't like what he purchased, killed the horse, then called or had the horse poisoned, then called the seller and told him, hey, I didn't like your horse, come get it. And then the seller showed up and it was dead. He was like, what the heck happened?
Well,
then he's lying. And so then the seller doesn't catch him and then he gets his money back. That's what happens in this world today, Jocelyn.
And then there would be a court case.
There wouldn't be a court case.
There would
seller
be a court
would
case.
know. Wouldn't know.
I mean, maybe
the buyer totally
maybe not.
set him up.
That's true. We'll talk about the buyer's duties and rights in a second.
Yeah,
too.
well, there's no duty of right in this world anymore, all right?
Okay, so if the contract is silent, the UCC adds clarity as to when the risk of loss is. So liability is what the risk of loss is. So in a shipment contract, which is when the seller ships it to the buyer, liability passes to the buyer when the goods are delivered to the carrier, which is kind of what we talked about before.
Yeah.
In a destination contract, liability passes to the buyer when the goods are delivered to the destination. So this is like Amazon's policy, like they have no liability, you know what I mean, once the person has it. Although they are working with third seller parties, and so sometimes they'll do like return policies and stuff, but this
But if it
is
breaks before it gets to your door, then they're responsible for
correct.
it.
Yes.
But how do you determine that?
Well, a lot of times if
I
you,
guess they always take it back if it's broken, right?
yeah.
Except
Well,
for
and
we
if
have a
you
light
get
over there that
something
never got
to-
returned, that's broken.
if you get
I
something,
wish we could return that
if you
light.
get something and then you're like the package is damaged
Yeah,
and then the product is damaged, like
Yeah.
it's something happened in
yeah,
transit.
something over there happened that light.
So
Busted.
for non-moved goods, if the person is the merchant, the liability passes when the buyer takes physical possession, which is kind of what we talked about. And if they're not the merchant, liability passes when the seller notifies the buyer that the goods are ready for pickup.
Okay.
So, and was
What
important
if
to,
they're not there though?
well, it doesn't matter because he just has to notify them.
So if somebody steals it,
Tough luck.
the buyer still,
The seller, or yeah, the buyer, the buyer.
wow, that's a dumb contract.
Well, and keep in mind, it
No
did
one
say in
uses
the
that one
textbook as
anymore.
well, the rules may be modified if the contract is breached. So if something happens, then it could be modified. We'll go over this really quickly. Basically, it kind of talks about performance. Just basically, the UCC requires that the seller delivers goods. Like it just is basically requiring that each person live up to the contract, whatever their contract may be. So kind of going over the buyer's duties and rights. So they have the right to inspect the goods. Like if you were going to pick something up off of KSL, like you totally have the right to inspect it and say yes or no. They have the right to reject it if you didn't like the thing.
What do you think that would happen?
What?
What about when we get into the lawnmower? Remember the guy tried to sell to somebody else mid us traveling there? What if we had gotten there and said, oh, we don't like it?
Yeah.
Then he would have been like, well, I had somebody else lined up and you guys already said you were going to buy
Well,
it.
according to the law, you have the right to reject it. So you could tell them that. They have the right to revoke acceptance. So in some circumstances, the defect in goods can't immediately be determined. So if they purchased $500,000 in toy boats and upon receipt check to ensure that it floats,
Then
you would
they
accept them. But if you find out that 200,000 of the boats sink in the water, then you could revoke your acceptance. And then they have the right to damages. So if the buyer does not receive the goods he bargained for, the buyer may have to purchase the goods elsewhere, often for a higher price, so they can get their money back in damages. And then the seller's duties and rights, they have the right to cure. So if the buyer rejects the goods for nonconformity, the UCC allows the seller to cure the defective performance, assuming that the defect is relatively minor. They have the right to reclaim the goods. So if the seller finds that the goods have been delivered to another buyer who has acted wrongfully, the seller's given the right to reclaim the goods.
All right.
They have the right to resell. And then they also have the right to damages. So if the goods are sold for less than the contract price with the breaching buyer, the seller has the right to damages for the difference in price. So just kind of interesting, something to think about as you buy things on KSL, you know?
Yeah,
Just
except
never
for
know
all
what
of
can
our stuff
happen.
comes from Amazon, so.
Yeah, well, applies to that too. Moral of the story, do not buy a horse. Could be dead the next morning.
Well, you buy a horse.
And that's it.